The journey across the ocean had been a gray blur. For Elena Rossi, the sound of the ship's engines was the sound of her own rattling bones, the constant vibration a reminder that nothing in her life was still. She was only 24, but the war, the struggle, and the unspeakable things she had seen and endured had aged her spirit far beyond her years. Elena was not a regular prisoner of war. She was a ghost, a survivor. In the mountains of her native Italy, she had fought with the partisans, risking everything to undermine the fascist and German grip. She had been captured, yes, and in the months that followed, she had learned the true bitter meaning of brutality. The enemy soldiers had viewed her and the other captured women not as fighters or even as people, but as objects, objects of interrogation, objects of labor, and objects for their own dark desires. The memory of the camp, its cold, its hunger, and its relentless humiliation, was a shadow that clung to her skin tighter than the rough blanket she now clutched. The Americans had liberated her, but liberation did not mean freedom, not yet. Because of the sensitive nature of the information she carried and the deep emotional scars she bore, she and a small group of other female survivors were placed under the protective, yet highly regulated control of the United States Army. They were being moved to a discreet, small military post deep inside America, place the brass in Washington had deemed secure enough to process them, without alerting the press or the lingering political enemies back in Europe. The train ride from the port was slow and uneventful, winding through a landscape that looked impossibly vast and well-fed. Elena sat by the window, but she couldn't truly see the green fields or the neat small towns flashing by. She only saw the reflection of her own face, hollow-eyed, vigilant, waiting for the next blow. She was alive, yes, but the fear was still a living, breathing thing inside her chest. It had been her constant companion for so long that she was lost without its cold, familiar grip. Every kindness was suspected. Every door that opened was a sign of impending pain. Finally, the train groaned to a halt at a tiny, dusty station. The sign above the depot read Harmony Creek, U.S. Army Annex. It was late afternoon. The light was golden, slanting across the flat, open fields, yet to Elena, the air felt heavy and thick with unease. 2 military trucks waited for them. The guards who escorted them off the train were large, quiet men in crisp American uniforms. They carried rifles and their faces were hard to read. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in a low, efficient tone that felt impersonal, almost mechanical. This silence, this lack of the usual sneering or shouting she was accustomed to from her previous captors, was unnerving. It was a blank page, and Elena's mind, trained by terror, immediately began to write the worst possible outcomes onto it. As the women were being counted and lined up, a small group of officers approached the truck. This was where the processing began, she knew. This was where the power balance would be established, where they would be sized up, judged, and categorized. The first officer to speak was a major. His name, she would soon learn, was Major Silas Benson. Major Benson was a man in his late 40s, neatly pressed with a high, receding hairline and a self-satisfied expression. He was not a field soldier. His boots were too shiny, his posture too rigid in a way that spoke of desk work and regulations, not mud and courage. He approached the women with a frown of annoyance, holding a clipboard like a weapon. "All right, let's move this along," Major Benson barked, his voice carrying the sharp, unpleasant authority that Elena knew well. "We don't have all night. These women are to be processed and secured immediately. They are listed as high-value political detainees with a history of enemy engagement. Don't treat them like tourists. Treat them like what they are, potential security risks." Elena felt a familiar cold wave wash over her. High-value political detainees. The title was a lie, a categorization that stripped her of her heroism and cloaked her in suspicion. She was a hero of the resistance, a victim of the enemy, yet here, in the land of the liberators, she was labeled a threat. It was the first moment of deep, profound injustice she encountered on American soil. She stood taller, her jaw set, refusing to meet Major Benson's dismissive, cold eyes. "Major, with all respect, their escort reports indicate their status is complicated," said a voice that was noticeably calmer and deeper. This was the second officer. Captain Samuel Miller? Captain Miller was younger than Major Benson, perhaps early 30s, with a face that looked tired but kind. He stood slightly apart, not radiating the fussy authority of the Major, but a quiet, watchful professionalism. He wore the dust of the road on his own boots, suggesting he had recently arrived from actual field work, perhaps even from overseas. Captain Miller looked at the group of women, and his gaze lingered for a moment on Elena. Unlike the Major, who only saw paperwork and risk, Captain Miller seemed to see effort, pain, and maybe even a flicker of recognition. But his face remained neutral, a mask of military discipline. Complicated is an understatement, Captain. Major Benson sneered, adjusting his stiff collar. The paperwork is a mess. They're European. They're women. They've been in various situations. It makes for a volatile mix. Frankly, I don't like the assignment. They should be in a secure hospital, not my annex. But orders are orders. We maintain strict security. No unauthorized contact. No coddling. Especially not for the one who seems to think she's in charge of the group. Major Benson's eyes flickered toward Elena, clearly identifying her as the target of his last remark. Even among the exhausted women, Elena's posture was different. She had not slumped. She had not cried. She stood straight, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her intense dark eyes fixed on a point just over the Major's shoulder, a silent, furious refusal to be broken. Her spirit, though battered, was not bent. "Yes, sir," Captain Miller replied, his tone respectful but lacking the Major's edge. He did not look at Elena, but his presence seemed to offer a momentary shield against the Major's contempt. The transfer took place quickly. Each woman was escorted one by one to a waiting military vehicle. As Elena was led past Major Benson, he stopped her with a curt, unpleasant gesture of his clipboard. "You," he said, his voice low and full of barely concealed mockery. "I read your file. You claim to be a hero, a partisan, yet you were found, let's just say, in a highly compromised position in a German compound. Don't try to play the innocent victim here. On this base, you follow the rules. Any sign of defiance, any attempt to manipulate the men, and you will be dealt with. Do you understand, Miss Rossi?" He had used the word manipulate. The sheer, cold injustice of it, the way he reduced her survival, her terrible sacrifice, to a cheap, feminine trick, made a hot, bitter taste rise in her throat. She looked him directly in the eye for the first time. Her look was not fear. It was pure, unadulterated strength, the fire of a woman who had faced death daily and mocked it. She didn't speak the English that well yet, but the look needed no translation. Major Benson, momentarily taken aback by the intensity in her eyes, quickly recovered and gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Get her out of my sight. Take her to Barracks C isolation protocol." Elena was escorted to a jeep and driven slowly through the small, impeccably neat base. Fort Harmony was a picture of American suburban military calm, freshly painted wooden barracks, perfect square lawns, and a flagpole with a huge, crisp flag snapping in the evening breeze. It was a world away from the smoking ruins and muddy trenches she had left behind. It was too clean, too quiet. It was the quiet of a trap. She was taken to the designated building, Barracks C. It was a small, plain building, isolated from the others. Inside, the corridor was long and sterile. Her assigned room was Spartan, a simple cot, a steel desk, and a bare window covered with a heavy steel mesh. The door clanged shut behind her with a sound that echoed her own defeat. The cold had returned, but this time it was the cold of American suspicion. She sat on the edge of the cot. She was alone. The silence was absolute. She listened for sounds of the usual things, the drunken laughter, the rough commands, the heavy boots approaching her door with sinister intent. She waited for the sound of a key turning, followed by the inevitable violation she had learned to brace for. Her body tensed, preparing for a fight she knew she would lose. This was what always came next. This was the pattern of the last terrible year, but the minutes stretched into an hour. The only sound was the far-off chirping of crickets outside. The only light was the fading orange of the sunset filtering through the mesh. Major Benson's dismissal, his insult, echoed in her mind. Don't try to play the innocent victim. Elena was no innocent. But she was certainly a victim, and more, she was a fighter. The injustice of being mistaken for a high-value enemy combatant, or worse, a woman trying to manipulate the men, burned hotter than the physical hunger in her stomach. It was a hunger for recognition, for the truth of her sacrifice. She had been a courier for vital intelligence, operating right under the noses of the enemy command. When she was finally caught, she had swallowed the piece of paper that held the location of a key German supply depot rather than let it fall into their hands. The consequence of that act was months of escalating horror, of being used and abused until she was barely a shell. The 10 minutes Captain Miller had promised Elena for preparation felt like a whole lifetime condensed into a frantic, short span. She splashed cold water from the small sink onto her face, trying to scrub away the exhaustion that had settled into her bones and the lingering scent of smoke and fear that her mind insisted was still on her skin. She looked at her reflection, gaunt, with eyes too large for her face, but still holding that defiant spark. She would not hide her face. She would not drop her gaze. Exactly 10 minutes later, the door latch clicked, and the door was opened by the same guard who had brought her the food. He nodded curtly toward the hall. Beside him stood a woman in a crisp white uniform, a lieutenant, clearly part of the medical staff. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her expression was professional, but not unkind. Elena felt a small, almost imperceptible easing of the tension in her shoulders. The captain had kept his first promise. The escort included a woman, Miss Rossi. "You will follow me," the lieutenant said in a gentle but firm voice, speaking in English. Elena nodded, understanding the command even if the nuances of the language were still slow to grasp. She walked out of the sterile cell, her steps measured and deliberate. She felt exposed, walking down the long corridor and then outside into the morning light of Fort Harmony. The American base was now fully active. Soldiers walked briskly to their duties, but as she passed, a subtle, almost silent shift occurred. Every head turned. This was the American reaction she had dreaded. It was not the loud, leering contempt of her former captors, but a cold, intense curiosity. The men stared, not just at her, but at the group of women following behind. Their gaze was heavy, weighing her down, trying to decipher her label. Enemy? Spy? Victim? Then she saw Major Benson. He was standing on the porch of the main administration building, observing the procession. His expression was a dark blend of disdain and smug irritation. He looked specifically at Elena. His stare was not one of admiration or even concern. It was judgmental, conveying without words his low opinion of her character and her claims. As she passed, Major Benson stepped off the porch. He didn't speak to her, but he spoke loudly to an enlisted man nearby. "I want the security on Barracks C doubled," he stated, his voice carrying clearly to Elena. "And make sure those women understand the rules. No special privileges. They are detainees. They are volatile. They are here for one reason, to be sorted. Nothing more." He paused, then added, with a dismissive wave towards Elena's back, "Some of these European women have a knack for drama. Don't let their theatrics confuse you. They are not our heroes." The condescension, the public mockery of her suffering and her courage hit Elena like a sharp slap. Theatrics, her sacrifice, her months of terror reduced to a performance. It fueled the internal fire she desperately needed to keep alive. She refused to react, walking straight ahead, but deep inside, she vowed that this man, this Major Benson, would not break her spirit. The lieutenant led her into a small, clean medical building. Inside, the walls were bright white, and the air smelled sharply of disinfectant. The room she entered was simple: a narrow examination table, a screened-off corner for privacy, and a desk. Sitting at the desk was a woman in a captain's uniform, the doctor. She had short, practical hair and warm, serious eyes. Next to her, standing quietly, was the lieutenant who had escorted her, Nurse Thompson. "Please sit, Miss Rossi," the doctor said, her voice low and kind. She spoke English, but Nurse Thompson immediately translated for Elena in fluent, gentle Italian. "I am Captain Davies. We are going to conduct a physical assessment. It will be entirely professional. Nurse Thompson will be here the entire time. There are no men in this building right now except for the guard outside." Elena finally took a full breath. The air in the room, despite the antiseptic smell, felt lighter than the air outside. She looked at Captain Davies, then at Nurse Thompson. There was no pity in their eyes, which she would have rejected, but there was a quiet, profound respect for her privacy and her body. "Thank you," Elena whispered in Italian, the first word she had spoken on American soil that wasn't a mumbled response to a guard. The examination was meticulous. Captain Davies was thorough, checking her wounds, her weight, her basic reflexes. She asked simple, factual questions about her diet and any lingering pain, and Nurse Thompson translated with sensitivity. When Captain Davies had to touch her, to press gently on a rib or listen to her heart, she did so with an economy of movement, always explaining what she was doing beforehand, always maintaining absolute professional distance. There was no lingering, no unnecessary exposure, no hint of the dark, invasive nature of the examinations she had endured in the camps. In the midst of the checkup, Captain Davies noted the severity of some old, poorly healed bruises. She asked Nurse Thompson to ask Elena about them, to be sure they were not current. Elena hesitated. She couldn't speak of the why of those wounds, the specific, humiliating details. Her voice failed her. Nurse Thompson simply placed a gentle, professional hand on Elena's arm, a gesture of solidarity, not pity. "We only need to know that they are healing, dear, not the story of how they were received. Your strength is evident, Miss Rossi. We just want to help you recover." It was the first time in months a simple truth had been spoken to her, acknowledged without suspicion or a demand for sensational detail. Her throat tightened, and she had to swallow hard to keep the powerful surge of emotion down. "They are old," Elena managed to say in Italian. "They are healing." "Good," Captain Davies concluded, marking her chart. "We will put you on a high-protein diet immediately and a vitamin regimen. We will check on you daily. You need rest, you need quiet, and you need to eat," the appointment concluded, and Nurse Thompson escorted Elena back to Barracks C. As they walked, Nurse Thompson slowed her pace, walking side by side with her. "I am Mary Thompson," she said softly, switching to Italian. "I fought hard to be assigned here, to look after you women. I know, I can only imagine. But here you are safe, truly safe. Do not believe the Major. He is a small man in a large uniform. His mind is small, too. We are not all like him." Elena looked at her, an American woman, a soldier, who was showing her kindness in a place where she expected only coldness. A wave of exhaustion, now that the immediate threat of the examination was gone, washed over her. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Back in Barracks C, the room felt different. The threat of immediate physical abuse had been momentarily lifted. But the mental battle with Major Benson's disdain continued. He saw her as a schemer, a weakling, a liar. Over the next few days, Elena was kept strictly isolated as per the Major's protocol. Her only contact was with the guards who brought her food and Nurse Thompson, who would visit briefly each morning and evening to check her pulse and ensure she was eating. The food, though suspicious at first, was consistently good and plentiful. Meat, fresh vegetables, sweet American desserts. It was restoring her body, but the isolation was working on her mind. She would pace her room, reciting the names of her fallen resistance comrades, reliving the moments of her fight, trying to keep the memory of her true purpose clear. One afternoon, Major Benson came to Barracks C himself. He did not enter her room, but stood just outside the door, speaking through the tiny barred window. "Miss Rossi," he called out, his voice sharp. "We found a scrap of material, some Italian lace, tucked into your baggage. It will be confiscated. We allow no unauthorized personal items, especially not things that could be used for, shall we say, distraction." Elena felt a stab of pain. That piece of lace was from a handkerchief, a gift from her mother, the only personal item she had managed to smuggle through the camps. It was her last link to her home, her past, her identity before the war consumed her. "It is my mother's," Elena said in heavily accented English, her voice shaking slightly with the injustice. "It is not a weapon, it is just—" "Fabric!" Major Benson laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Fabric, of course. Look, Miss Rossi, you need to understand that this is the United States Army. We are not interested in your sentimental trinkets. We are interested in your cooperation. We know your type. You cry, you make excuses, you use your beauty to gain favor. Save your tears. It won't work here. You'll get it back when you leave. If you leave. His words were a concentrated venom. He was mocking her strength, insulting her attempts to hold on to her last shred of dignity. He was denying her humanity, reducing her to a stereotype. The insult was profound not because of the lace, but because he assumed she was weak enough to use tears or beauty when she had used her courage and mind to survive. Elena looked at him, not with fear but with a cold, clear rage. Small man in a large uniform, as Nurse Thompson had said. "I do not cry for men like you," Elena stated clearly in English, her pronunciation suddenly perfect because the feeling behind the words was so strong. "I only cry for the dead." Major Benson's face went pale with surprise and then flushed with fury. He was not used to a supposed captive speaking back with such controlled fire. "That's enough," he snapped. "You'll learn respect, Miss Rossi. You're lucky to be alive, and luckier still that we are wasting resources keeping you here. Tomorrow morning we begin the official debriefing. You will answer every question, every single one, and I will be watching your every..." The following morning, the atmosphere in Barracks C was heavy with a silent, waiting tension. Elena did not eat the breakfast the guard slid through the hatch. Her stomach was tied in a cold, hard knot. All her focus was directed inward, preparing her mind for the ordeal ahead. She practiced the mental tricks she had learned in the camp, separating her mind from her body, finding a small, safe place in her memory where no one could touch her. Exactly at 9 o'clock. Captain Miller arrived with 2 military police guards. He looked formal and serious, carrying a stack of thick files that Elena knew contained the partial, inaccurate, and heavily biased reports of her capture and background. "Miss Rossi," Captain Miller said, his Italian steady. "It is time. We are moving to the debriefing room. You will answer all questions truthfully. Your cooperation is noted and is in your best interest." Elena simply nodded. She would cooperate with the truth, but nothing more. The walk to the debriefing room was short, across the well-kept lawn to the main administration building where Major Benson had stood the day before. The room itself was small and institutional. It was a simple office, but arranged in a way that maximized the feeling of pressure. A plain metal table dominated the center. On one side were 2 chairs for the American officers. On the other side was a single uncomfortable wooden chair for her. A single bright desk lamp was pointed directly at her seat. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless green. Major Benson was already sitting at the table, looking like a vulture waiting for its meal. His arms were folded tightly across his chest, and his eyes were already drilling into her with his usual mixture of suspicion and personal contempt. He did not greet her. He simply pointed to the wooden chair. "Sit!" he commanded in sharp English, not bothering with a translator. "We don't have time for hesitation." Elena sat, her back perfectly straight. She felt the warmth of the lamp on her face, the harsh light already beginning to make her eyes strain. The room smelled of old paper and stale coffee, and the pressure of the 2 men, one actively hostile, the other quietly observant, pressed down on her like a physical weight. Captain Miller took the second seat. He opened his file, sorting through the papers with methodical care. He looked up at Elena, and for a moment, their eyes met. His look was professional, yet she searched frantically for the kindness she had seen before. But it was buried deep beneath a layer of official duty. "Miss Rossi," Captain Miller began in his precise Italian, "I will be conducting the primary questioning. Major Benson is here to observe the proceedings and ensure all protocols are strictly followed. We are recording your statement. The microphone is on the table. Speak clearly and only when asked a direct question." He read the basic facts from her file: her name, her date of birth, her last known address in Italy. Elena confirmed the information in a low, clear voice. Then Captain Miller leaned forward slightly, his demeanor shifting from bureaucratic to intensely focused. "Now let us discuss the partisan activity. Your file states you were a courier. Who was your immediate commanding officer?" Elena gave a false name she had prepared long ago, one that had already been discredited in the chaos of the war, protecting the actual commanders. A man named Pietro. He was killed in the fighting near Genoa. Major Benson leaned in, his face tight with skepticism. Killed? Convenient, isn't it, Captain? Every prisoner claims their leader is dead. She's lying. Don't waste time on the small stuff, Miller. Get to the important part. Major Benson spoke in English, clearly intending for his subordinate to take his cue, but also to let Elena hear his accusation. Captain Miller ignored the major, continuing in Italian. Miss Rossi, we need to understand the specifics of your capture. Your file indicates you were apprehended in a German military compound, dressed in civilian clothes, attempting to leave under false pretenses. Is that accurate? Elena took a slow breath. This was the turning point. This was where the enemy had always shifted from questions to accusations, from words to hands. I was captured on a mission, Elena stated clearly. I was attempting to pass intelligence to a contact in the compound's auxiliary kitchen staff. The mission failed. I was captured on my way out. This was the half-truth she had clung to. She could not reveal the intelligence she had carried even to the Americans, until she was absolutely certain of their trust. A kitchen staff contact, Major Benson scoffed, leaning back and looking at the ceiling as if the story was tedious. In a heavily guarded SS compound? Come on, Captain. That's absurd. Ask her about the circumstances of her detention. Ask her about the, accommodations she received. The Major's use of the word accommodations was loaded, dripping with sarcasm and his earlier accusation of manipulation. He was clearly leading the conversation toward the most humiliating part of her past, intending to use it not to understand her as a victim, but to degrade her as a liar. Elena's heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. She expected Captain Miller to follow the Major's obvious direction, to seize upon the most vulnerable aspect of her history, to use the horror she had endured as a tool to extract information or simply to assert dominance. That was the way of power she knew. The captain would press her, demand humiliating details, and then inevitably, when she refused, the physical and emotional assault would begin. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, steeling herself. She remembered the sheer, crushing weight of the German interrogator, the cold steel of his weapon, the way he had laughed when she cried out. She was ready to endure it again. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would simply refuse to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. When she opened her eyes, she was ready for the lamp to be turned up higher, for the chair to be shoved forward, for the Major to finally cross the line and lay a hand on her, demanding compliance. Her fists were clenched tightly in her lap, her body prepared to absorb the first shock. Captain Miller saw the fear, the sudden, intense tensing of her muscles, the flicker of sheer terror in her eyes. He saw her brace herself, her whole posture screaming in expectation of violence. But Captain Miller did not follow Major Benson's lead. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He picked up a glass of water from the table and slowly pushed it across the surface until it was directly in front of Elena. Miss Rossi, Captain Miller said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming softer, yet firm in its professionalism. He spoke slowly, emphasizing every word in Italian. Before we proceed to the sensitive details of your confinement, I want to ensure you are comfortable and hydrated. The intensity of questioning can be draining. He then glanced briefly at Major Benson, a look that was polite but firm, clearly communicating a boundary. He did not change his tone, but his next words were clearly meant for the Major as well as for Elena. I must remind myself and all parties present of the protocol established for all women who served in the resistance and were subsequently held in enemy detention, especially those facing significant trauma. The Geneva Conventions and specific U.S. Army directives regarding the humane treatment of high-value witnesses demand that we proceed with absolute respect for the individual's physical and psychological integrity. He paused, letting the formal language sink in. He did not use the loaded term from the YouTube title, but he used language that was far more powerful. Absolute respect for the individual's physical and psychological integrity. Captain Miller then looked directly at Elena, his gaze steady and clear. I have reviewed the files from the other women in your group. I understand what you were exposed to in the enemy camps. We are not interested in creating further trauma. We are only interested in facts vital to the ongoing effort to secure peace. We will not dwell on the methods of your captors. We will focus on what you know about the enemy." He then leaned back, putting distance between himself and the table. He picked up a pen and rested it lightly on the file. "Now," he continued, his voice returning to a formal tone, "if you require a break, Miss Rossi, you need only raise your hand. You do not have to endure anything here that causes you undue distress. Do you understand this condition?" Elena stared at him, her heart still hammering, but now with a strange, dizzying mixture of confusion and shock. She had been bracing for a physical blow, a shouted command, a violation of her space. Instead, she had been offered water, a moment of rest, and a stated promise of respect. Major Benson, on the other hand, looked furious. He shifted in his chair, leaning forward to address Captain Miller in a low, tight voice. "Captain, you're being soft. This woman is likely wasting our time. We have a war to wrap up. We need this information now, and I need to know why she was found in that particular condition. Her credibility depends on her full disclosure. We can't coddle her. She needs to understand the gravity of her situation." Captain Miller turned his full attention to Major Benson. His face remained calm, but his eyes held a steely, unyielding edge that Elena had not seen before. "Major," Captain Miller said, his voice quiet, which somehow made the words more intimidating. "My orders are clear, and my orders are to treat all individuals, regardless of their past or current status, with the highest degree of military honor and professionalism. That means respecting boundaries. That means focusing on intelligence, not on personal degradation." Elena sat motionless, clutching the cold glass of water, trying to process the strange, sudden shift in the atmosphere of the room. The initial terror was replaced by a dizzying sense of confusion. She had prepared for war, for brutality, for the inevitable moment when her body would become the battleground. Instead, she was being offered water and a rest break. The silence in the room was now heavy with Major Benson's suppressed fury and Captain Miller's quiet, Haitian expectation. Captain Miller began the questioning again, returning to the dry, factual list of intelligence points. He asked about troop movements, supply lines, communication codes she might have overheard, and the faces of her German and fascist captors. He asked about the names of officers and the specific type of equipment she saw in the compound. He was relentlessly focused on the enemy, on the war effort, and on information, never on her person. Major Benson, seated beside him, huffed and shifted constantly. He was clearly waiting for the moment to pounce, for the captain to falter, or for Elena to show a sign of contradiction that he could exploit. At one point, Captain Miller asked a question about a specific code word that Elena remembered being used by a high-ranking German officer. She hesitated, struggling to recall the exact sequence of letters. Her memory was a painful mosaic, shattered by months of hardship. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to rebuild the moment in her mind. Major Benson saw the hesitation and immediately seized the opportunity. He slammed his hand onto the metal table, the sound echoing loudly in the small room. "She's inventing it, Captain!" Major Benson shouted in English, his face red with frustration. "Look at her! She's playing games, looking weak to buy time to lie." We all know her type. She's stalling. She needs to be pressed. Tell her that if she withholds information, her status changes immediately. The major's voice was loud, aggressive, exactly the tone that in the German camp had always preceded the physical assault. Elena flinched instinctively, her hands flying up to shield her face, anticipating the strike that was sure to follow. This was the moment she knew, the moment the professional veneer broke and the true nature of power was revealed. But the strike never came. No hand was laid upon her. Instead, Captain Miller reacted instantly, not with anger directed at Elena, but with a cold, absolute professionalism directed at his superior. "Major Benson, that is out of order," Captain Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper, which somehow held more authority than the major's shout. He spoke in flawless English, a direct military command. "You will maintain discipline in this room. You will not yell. You will not threaten the witness. I specifically stated that she could take a break if needed. Her hesitation is a sign of trauma, not deception. If you cannot maintain control of your temper, I will be forced to request your removal from this proceeding." Major Benson stared at him, aghast, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. For the first time, Elena saw genuine fear mixed with his anger. Captain Miller had challenged him, not with a personal insult, but with the full, serious weight of military law and protocol. The threat to have him removed, to diminish his authority in front of a subordinate and a prisoner, was a deep professional humiliation. Major Benson swallowed hard, settling back into his chair, though his hands remained clenched white-knuckled on his thighs. He had been refused outright and decisively by the very officer he had tried to intimidate. Captain Miller then turned back to Elena. He spoke in a softer, apologetic tone in Italian. "I apologize for the disturbance, Miss Rossi. Please ignore the Major. Take your time. Close your eyes if it helps. Just focus on the code word. We can move on to other areas and return to this later." Elena slowly lowered her hands. The shock was profound. It wasn't just the refusal to touch her. It was the refusal to allow anyone else to touch her or threaten her or abuse their authority in her presence. The American officer, the captain, had sacrificed his own professional ease, openly defying a superior simply to uphold a principle of respect for her dignity. She looked at Captain Miller. His eyes were focused on the file, but his attitude radiated an unyielding commitment to his code. He was not kind in a gentle, weak way. He was kind in a structured, fiercely honorable way. This was the discipline she hadn't seen before. The Major's discipline was control over others. The captain's discipline was control over himself, adhering to a code that was higher than his own momentary convenience or success. It was this moment that shattered the wall of Elena's resistance. The Germans and fascists had used violence and fear to try to break her mind. The Americans were using dignity and honor to break the fear, and dignity was proving to be the far more powerful weapon. A fragile tear slipped down Elena's cheek, not a tear of pain, but a tear of disbelief. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the unexpected display of emotion. Major Benson would certainly mock it, but she found she no longer cared what he thought. She focused, took a deep breath, and was finally able to recall the code word. "Lupo bianco," she whispered. "White wolf. It means white wolf." Captain Miller jotted it down without fanfare. "Thank you, Miss Rossi. That is extremely valuable. Now, let's talk about the map you drew for your resistance contact." The rest of the interrogation proceeded in the same stunning, professional manner. Captain Miller spent 2 hours going through the details of her partisan work and her capture, focusing solely on the intelligence. He never asked about the specifics of the abuse. He only acknowledged that she had been compromised in a way that had been traumatic and was not relevant to the current intelligence assessment. He refused to let the process become personal, and Major Benson, silenced and fuming, could only observe. When the session was finally concluded, Captain Miller stacked his papers neatly. He stood up, and Elena stood up as well, her legs feeling unsteady from the sheer, sustained tension. "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Rossi," Captain Miller said in Italian. "This information is important. It will be passed on immediately. You will be returned to Barracks C for rest. We may require another shorter session tomorrow, but today's work is complete." As they were leaving the room, Major Benson finally found his voice, addressing the captain in a low, seething tone, fully expecting Elena not to understand. "You've made a mistake, Miller," the Major spat. "You went soft. You let her control the narrative. She's a known risk, a civilian, and a woman who was in a German camp for months. She has to be dirty in one way or another. You should have pushed her hard. You should have shown her that we are in control. She's going to take advantage of your weakness." Captain Miller paused in the doorway, turning his head just slightly, fixing the Major with a level. "Cold stare, Major," Captain Miller replied, his voice still low, now entirely in English. "The goal here is not control. The goal is truth. And the goal is to win the war, not to act like the enemy we just defeated. She will not take advantage of honor. She will respect it. She is a woman who stared down the enemy and survived. Our duty is not to break her, but to recognize her. Your attitude is a violation of the code we wear on our uniform. I suggest you reconsider your definition of weakness, Major." He then turned and walked out, leaving Major Benson alone in the oppressive quiet of the interrogation room. Elena was walking just ahead of Captain Miller, and though she hadn't understood every word, the tone and the sheer, raw fury in the Major's final outburst were clear, and she had understood the captain's parting sentence. The goal here is not control. The goal is truth. As she was escorted back across the sunlit lawn, Elena felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't known was possible. The fear was still there, but it was receding, pushed back by the astonishing revelation that there were men in power, men in uniform who saw her not as a means to an end, not as an object to be used, but as an individual deserving of respect and dignity. The Americans had refused to lay a hand on her, but in that refusal, they had restored a part of her soul that she had thought was lost forever. This unexpected honor, this quiet display of principle, was the foundation upon which her hope for justice and recognition was now being built. She realized that her fight was no longer just about survival. It was about ensuring the world knew the truth of what she and the others had done and what they had endured. The fear of the Major's next move remained, but now it was a secondary concern. The captain's code of honor was a shield, and Elena knew that she would finally be able to trust someone enough to tell the full, terrible story, not of her humiliation, but of her true sacrifice. The day after the debriefing, Elena requested to speak with Captain Miller again, but this time it was not for an interrogation. It was a request to share her complete testimony, the parts she had been holding back out of fear and caution. She had seen Captain Miller's resolve, his willingness to stand against a superior for the sake of integrity, and it was enough. She decided to risk everything on his honor. The next session was held in the same room, but the atmosphere was completely different. Major Benson was absent, having been assigned to a different task, a clear signal that Captain Miller was now in full command of the process. Nurse Thompson was present to translate, but also to act as a supportive professional presence, sitting quietly near Elena. The bright lamp was switched off, and the room was illuminated only by the soft, natural light of the morning. "Captain Miller," Elena began, speaking in a low, steady voice in Italian. "I told you the facts of my partisan work, the facts of the intelligence. That much was true. But I did not tell you the full truth of my capture and the months that followed. I did not trust you enough to tell you. Now I do. I need you to understand everything. Not for pity, but for the truth." Captain Miller nodded, his face solemn. "I am listening, Miss Rossi. Everything you say now will be officially recorded, but only used for justice, not for judgment." For the next 3 hours, Elena spoke. She did not speak of herself as a victim, but as a witness. She spoke about the nature of the German and fascist occupation, the cruel methods they used, and the deliberate degradation of captured women not just for information, but as a systematic campaign to break the spirit of the resistance. She spoke of the forced labor, the systematic starvation, and the constant threat of violence that hung over every single woman in the compound. She spoke of the women she saw break and the women she saw perish. And then she spoke of her sacrifice. "The intelligence I carried was about the German depot in La Spezia," Elena recounted, her voice shaking only slightly, carefully controlled. "It was a map of the supply caches. I was captured before I could pass it on. They beat me. They stripped me. They left me in a cold cell for 3 days. They kept saying, 'Tell us what you swallowed, little rat.' They thought I had swallowed a message, a piece of paper, which was true." She paused, taking a slow, deep breath, reliving the horror. Nurse Thompson reached out and squeezed her arm briefly, then let go, allowing Elena to continue with her own strength. But what they did not know was that the paper was a small piece of a detailed map, drawn on rice paper. "They beat me, but I didn't give them the information. After the beatings, the officer, a German captain, a brutal, arrogant man, told me that I was useless as a prisoner. He decided to use me as a servant in the officers' barracks. He said, 'At least you can scrub floors and serve the officers' needs?' I was moved to the barracks, where I saw other women, French, Polish, and Italian civilians who were forced into terrible, constant servitude. Elena's voice dropped, filled with a raw, controlled grief. They were broken, Captain. They had nothing left. But being there, scrubbing, serving, hearing the officers speak, I realized something. They were sloppy. The German captain would leave his daily duty roster, his travel plans, his list of contacts, lying on his desk. He had degraded me so much he no longer thought of me as a human or a threat, just a ghost cleaning his floors. She leaned forward, her eyes burning with the memory of her courage. My sacrifice was not the beating, Captain. My sacrifice was realizing I had an opportunity. I spent 3 months there. Every day I would memorize the names, the dates, the times. I would spend an hour in the washroom, tracing the information on a scrap of cloth, a tiny handkerchief my mother gave me, the one Major Benson confiscated. I used coal dust and water. I made a cipher, a code only I understood, hiding the details in the intricate patterns of the lace. When the Allies finally broke through, chaos erupted in the compound. In the confusion, I managed to reach the other women. We knew our chance had come. We fought the guards with whatever we could find. A knife, a broom handle. I got out and I got the handkerchief out. I passed it to a French resistance contact at the border, who then passed it to your own intelligence officers. That map, Captain, it wasn't just a location. It was the names of the German and fascist officers responsible for the systematic abuse of those women. I risked my life, not just for the war, but for justice for the women who couldn't escape. Captain Miller was silent for a long time. He looked down at his desk, his hand rubbing his forehead. Nurse Thompson was crying softly, tears streaming down her face. But she made no sound. Finally, Captain Miller looked up, his eyes wide with a profound, almost shattering respect. "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice husky. "That piece of lace? The handkerchief? It was the key to this intelligence?" "Yes," Elena confirmed. "It was the full truth hidden in a piece of fabric. I refused to part with it because it was their names. Their crimes. My mother's blessing. Major Benson took it from me, thinking it was a cheap object of sentiment, something for distraction. He took my evidence." Captain Miller stood up abruptly, his chair scraping back loudly. "The Major. He took evidence. He assumed a piece of lace was a petty female deception and confiscated vital intelligence." He walked over to the door and spoke sharply to the guard outside. "Find Major Benson immediately. Tell him I need the contents of Miss Rossi's confiscated property, specifically the lace handkerchief. I need it brought to me now." He returned to the table, his face a mask of determination. "Miss Rossi, I promise you that handkerchief will be recovered, and your testimony will be attached to an official top priority report detailing not only the intelligence, but the systematic abuse and the names of the officers you risked everything to identify. This is not just intelligence. This is an account of heroism and war crimes. Your sacrifice will not be in vain." Elena felt the last of her tension break. It wasn't the promise of the return of the lace that mattered, but the validation of her story, the acceptance of her full, terrible truth. The captain didn't view her trauma as a sign of weakness or an opportunity for exploitation. He saw it as a profound act of courage. Major Benson's deep injustice, his contempt, his dismissal of her as an emotional schemer, was now set to be exposed by Captain Miller's unwavering commitment to honor. Elena's journey was nearing its final, powerful turn. The battle was no longer for her survival, but for the respect and justice that was due to her and to the women she had fought to remember. The atmosphere in the administration building crackled with tension. Captain Miller had moved immediately. He had the power of protocol, and now, the absolute clarity of Elena's testimony, supported by Nurse Thompson's emotional witness. The guard returned, his face pale, with a grim report. Major Benson could not be located on the base, and the records indicated he had left Fort Harmony on an unscheduled drive to the nearest large city late that morning. "And the property?" Captain Miller demanded, his voice tight. "Sir, the Major signed out all of Miss Rossi's confiscated property this morning, immediately after our questioning session. He took it with him." The guard hesitated. "He put a note in the file, sir," he wrote, disposing of worthless sentimental items before they cause further distraction. A cold, precise fury settled over Captain Miller's face. Major Benson hadn't just made an error. He had committed an intentional act of destruction of evidence, driven by his contempt and misogyny. He didn't want Elena's theatrics to interfere with the simple, clean-cut paperwork of his command. He had stolen and likely destroyed the final piece of evidence that validated Elena's suffering and her heroism. "He is running," Captain Miller stated, turning to Nurse Thompson. He realized his mistake, or perhaps he intended this from the start. He assumed the lace was trash and has now destroyed a document of war crimes. "Miss Rossi, I apologize. This man has not just insulted you, he has committed a serious military offense." Elena's heart sank, but only for a moment. The physical evidence, the lace, was gone, but the truth was not. "The information is in my head, Captain," Elena said, her voice firm. "I memorized it. I can write the cipher exactly as I created it on the fabric. The names, the ranks, the dates. The Major can burn the cloth, but he cannot burn the memory." Captain Miller looked at her, and his respect deepened visibly. She was not a victim. She was a fortress of memory. "Then we shall proceed immediately," Captain Miller decided. He contacted a superior officer by telephone, reporting the full situation, Elena's testimony, the systematic abuse of women, the critical intelligence, and Major Benson's deliberate sabotage and likely desertion. He spoke with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man operating entirely on principle. Over the next 2 days, Elena worked tirelessly with Captain Miller and Nurse Thompson. She meticulously recreated the cipher and the list of names and events. She wrote down every single detail, every single face, every single location she had committed to memory over those terrible months. Her sacrifice, her endurance in the camp, was now transformed into a potent tool for international justice. When the full, heavily documented report was completed, Captain Miller didn't simply file it. He took action that transcended his rank and his base. He contacted a highly respected war correspondent he knew in Washington, D.C., a woman known for her integrity and courage. He ensured that Elena's testimony, vetted and corroborated by their base's intelligence analysis, would not only go to the military tribunal, but also to the American public. The exposure of the truth, he knew, was the only way to earn Elena the justice and respect she deserved. A week later, the first major newspaper article was published. It was titled, not sensationally, but with quiet dignity, "Italian partisan heroine reveals atrocities, coded lace holds. Key to war crimes." The article detailed the incredible courage of an unnamed Italian woman, Elena Rossi, who had deliberately exposed herself to the enemy's systematic cruelty, not to save her life, but to gather evidence of their crimes. It spoke of the dignity and professionalism she was finally receiving on American soil, contrasting it with the barbarity of her captors. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. Major Benson was quickly apprehended in a neighboring state, attempting to take a flight overseas. The small amount of property he had on him confirmed his identity and intent to flee. The ruined lace handkerchief, crumpled and tossed into a waste bin at his hotel, was recovered and confirmed as evidence of his attempt to destroy military documentation. He was immediately stripped of his rank and faced a full court-martial, not for his contempt, but for the destruction of classified evidence and insubordination. His public humiliation was complete. Justice served against the man who had mocked her as a schemer. Meanwhile, at Fort Harmony, Elena's status changed completely. She was no longer a high-value political detainee, but an honored war witness. One crisp afternoon, Captain Miller came to Barracks C, but this time, he didn't just stand outside. He opened the door fully and stood aside, allowing the sunlight to stream into the previously dark room. He was accompanied not by guards, but by a distinguished older general visiting from Washington. Nurse Thompson stood beside the general, her face beaming with pride. The general, a man with kind eyes and a chest full of ribbons, stepped forward. He did not ask her to stand to attention. He simply looked at her with profound respect. "Miss Rossi," the general said, his voice deep and warm. "The United States Army and the Allied Command thank you. Your courage, Your sacrifice and your remarkable memory have led to the swift identification of several key Axis war criminals, and your testimony has provided a voice for countless others. Your actions were beyond the call of duty for any soldier. He then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded document. It was not a discharge paper or a release form. It was a formal citation signed by a high-ranking official commending her bravery. "We cannot give you a military medal, Miss Rossi," the general continued, "as you were not formally enlisted in our forces. But we can give you this, a declaration of full, honored, and decorated status as a key member of the Italian resistance, recognized by the Allied forces. You are no longer a detainee. You are a heroine." He handed her the document. Elena took it with both hands, her fingers trembling. The words were in formal English and Italian, a permanent record of her truth. Captain Miller then stepped forward, his eyes shining with professional pride. "The paperwork for your safe transport to a new permanent home in New York is complete, Miss Rossi. You are free to go with our deepest respect. You have earned a life of peace." Elena looked down at the paper, then up at Captain Miller, then at Nurse Thompson. The shame and fear she had carried for so long finally lifted. The shadow was gone. The most powerful twist in her story was not revenge, but the earning of respect from the very men in uniform she had been trained to fear. The American soldiers had refused to lay a hand on her, and in that refusal, they had healed her. They had treated her not as an object of war, but as a valued human being, a partner in justice. Elena stood tall, straightening her shoulders, the posture of the defiant partisan finally matched by the reality of her acknowledged heroism. She was a survivor, a witness, and a hero. Justice had been served not with violence but with honor. Her long journey to redemption was finally complete. She simply nodded, a slight graceful movement of her head, and for the first time in a very long time she smiled. A genuine, unburdened, and utterly beautiful smile of victory.